The biblical mandate to care for widows, insights from the Old Testament, New Testament, and patristic writings. Introduction. Caring for widows is a moral duty that is deeply rooted in the teachings of the Bible and has been emphasized by early patristic saints. This essay aims to present a compelling argument for why people should prioritize the care and support of widows, drawing upon scriptural verses from the Old and New Testaments, as well as insights from early Christian writers. The Old Testament perspective. The Old Testament provides a rich and comprehensive foundation for the concept of caring for widows. The Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly highlight the importance of protecting and providing for widows, recognizing their vulnerability and the need for communal support. 1. God's concern for widows. Throughout the Old Testament, God's concern for widows is evident. In Deuteronomy 10:18, it is stated that God defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. This highlights God's compassionate nature and His expectation for His people to reflect His character by caring for widows. 2. Legal and social protection. The Mosaic Law contains specific provisions for the welfare of widows. In Exodus 22:22-24 and Deuteronomy 24:17-21, widows and orphans are given special consideration and are to be treated with justice and compassion. The Israelites were instructed not to take advantage of widows, but rather to provide them with support and ensure their well-being. 3. The prophetic call for justice. The prophets in the Old Testament frequently spoke out against social injustice, including the mistreatment of widows. Isaiah 1:17 declares, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow." The prophets called the people to actively seek justice for widows, emphasizing the ethical imperative of caring for them. 4. Widows as recipients of God's blessings. The Old Testament also highlights God's special concern for widows and their inclusion in His blessings. Psalm 68:5 describes God as a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows. In Psalm 146:9, it is affirmed that the Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow. These verses illustrate God's commitment to caring for widows and emphasize the importance of believers doing the same. 5. The widow of Zarephath, a testament of generosity, trust, and God's provision. During a severe drought and famine in the land, God commanded the prophet Elijah to go to the town of Zarephath and seek a widow there who would provide for him. When Elijah arrived, he encountered a widow gathering sticks and asked her for some water and bread. However, the widow explained that she only had a handful of flour and a little oil left, which she planned to use to prepare a final meal for herself and her son before they starved. Despite her dire circumstances, the widow's generosity and faith were evident as she willingly shared her meager provisions with Elijah, as instructed by the Lord. In response to her act of kindness and obedience, God miraculously multiplied the flour and oil, ensuring that the widow and her household had an abundant supply of food throughout the entire duration of the famine. Empathy and compassion. The widow of Zarephath demonstrated empathy and compassion by willingly sharing her limited resources with Elijah, even though she and her son were in desperate circumstances themselves. Her act of selflessness and care for the prophet reflected a deep understanding of the importance of providing for those in need, even when one's own situation is challenging. Trust and faith. The widow's decision to share her provisions with Elijah required a significant amount of trust and faith in God's promises. Despite her fear of scarcity and potential starvation, she chose to obey God's command and rely on His provision. This act of faith not only resulted in the multiplication of her food, but also showcased her belief in God's ability to sustain and care for her as a widow. See God's provision and blessing. Through the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, we see God's faithfulness in providing for widows in their time of need. God honored the widow's act of generosity and faith by miraculously sustaining her and her household throughout the famine. This narrative highlights God's commitment to caring for widows and demonstrates His ability to bless and provide for them in extraordinary ways. The story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath serves as a powerful example of widow care in the Old Testament. It emphasizes the importance of empathy, compassion, trust, and faith in providing for widows and shows how God rewards acts of kindness and obedience towards the vulnerable. By following this example, believers are called to prioritize the well-being and support of widows, reflecting God's character and fulfilling His commandments. The Old Testament establishes a firm foundation for the care and support of widows. God's concern for widows is evident throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, and His commandments and examples emphasize the importance of justice, compassion, and love towards this vulnerable group. By following the teachings of the Old Testament, believers are called to reflect God's character and extend their care to widows, ensuring their well-being and providing them with the support they need. 2. The New Testament perspective. The New Testament teachings of Jesus Christ and the apostles emphasize the significance of caring for widows. These teachings not only highlight the compassionate nature of Christ, but also provide practical guidance for the early Christian community in addressing the needs of widows. Jesus' compassion towards widows. Jesus' interactions with widows exemplify his deep compassion and concern for their well-being. One notable incident is the raising of the widow's son in Nain, Luke 7 verses 11 to 17. Jesus, moved by compassion, restores the widow's only son to life, recognizing the immense loss and vulnerability she experienced. This act demonstrates Jesus' empathy and his desire to bring comfort and restoration to widows in their time of grief. Another instance highlighting Jesus' care for widows is seen in the widow's offering at the temple, Mark 12 verses 41 to 44. Jesus commends the widow's sacrificial giving, pointing out that she gave all she had, while others contributed out of their abundance. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the value Jesus places on the generosity and faithfulness of widows, despite their limited means. Apostolic teaching on caring for widows. The Apostle James explicitly addresses the importance of caring for widows in his epistle. James 1:27 states that true religion involves visiting and providing for widows and orphans in their distress. By including widows in this instruction, James emphasizes the vulnerable position they often find themselves in and calls upon believers to actively demonstrate compassion and support for them. This teaching underscores the practical expression of faith through tangible acts of care and concern. See the early Christian community's response. The early Christian community depicted in Acts 6:1-6 provides a model for caring for widows within the church. In response to complaint about the unequal distribution of resources, the apostles appoint individuals, known as deacons, to ensure the equitable distribution of food and resources among widows. This communal response highlights the importance of addressing the specific needs of widows within the body of believers, ensuring their dignity and well-being are upheld. The care of widows in the New Testament is a recurring theme that reflects the heart of Jesus Christ and the apostolic teachings. Jesus exemplifies compassion and restoration in his interactions with widows, emphasizing their value and worth. The apostles, particularly James, underscore the responsibility of believers to actively care for widows and orphans in their distress. The early Christian community further demonstrates the practical implementation of this care through the appointment of deacons to ensure equitable distribution of resources. As followers of Jesus Christ, we are called to embody this compassionate care for widows, extending support, provision, and love to those who are vulnerable and in need. 3. Insights from patristic writings. The early patristic saints, who lived in the first centuries of Christianity, echoed the biblical mandate to care for widows. St. Ignatius of Antioch, in his letter to the Smyrnaeans, emphasizes the importance of assisting widows, stating that it is a sign of true love and devotion to God. Similarly, Clement of Alexandria in his work The Instructor encourages believers to support widows, as they have been left vulnerable and in need of assistance. These early Christian writers recognized the social and economic challenges faced by widows and advocated for their care as a reflection of Christian values. Furthermore, the Didache, an early Christian document dating back to the 1st century, provides an additional example of the importance placed on caring for widows. In Chapter 4, the Didache instructs believers to give to those in need, including widows, and not to turn away from those who are in need of assistance. This instruction reinforces the commitment of the early Christian community to support widows and highlights the recognition of their vulnerable situation. By integrating the example from the Didache, we can further strengthen the argument for the care of widows in the early Christian community, demonstrating that multiple sources within the early patristic tradition emphasize the significance of providing support and assistance to widows as an essential part of living out the Christian faith. Conclusion. The Bible, through its Old and New Testament teachings, as well as the writings of early patristic saints, provides a compelling case for the care and support of widows. The commandments and examples in Scripture emphasize the importance of justice, compassion, and love towards this vulnerable group. As believers, it is our responsibility to follow these teachings and extend our care to widows in practical ways, such as providing emotional support, financial assistance, and advocating for their rights. By doing so, we not only fulfill our biblical mandate, but also demonstrate the love and compassion of Christ to those in need.